Australia, like many of our Western counterparts, is a country built on the backs of immigrants. And in our brief history, peoples from every corner of the globe have come to our shores, and today, Australia is one of the most culturally diverse nations in the world. This immigration has arguably occurred over the entirety of Australia's history in one way or another, and is no better reflected than in the birthplaces of Australia's paramount leaders, the Prime Ministers. Australia is a country, and like many of our fellow Commonwealth countries, we are led by a leader known as the Prime Minister. Of course, in a relatively short history, we have had both good Prime Ministers, bad Prime Ministers, some who have shat themselves in McDonald's, and some who have disappeared while swimming. In our relatively short history, 30 men and 1 woman have served as Prime Minister since the position's creation in 1901. Out of the 31 Prime Ministers, only 2 have served 3 non-consecutive terms in office, these being Alfred Deakin and Andrew Fisher. Alongside this, only 2 Prime Ministers have served 2 non-consecutive terms, these being Robert Menzies and Kevin Rudd. Today, our 31st Prime Minister is Anthony Albanese, who has served as the country's Prime Minister since May 23, 2022. Today, only 7 former Prime Ministers, Keating, Howard, Rudd, Gillard, Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison, are still living. Sadly, Bob Hawke, who passed away on May 16, 2019, was the most recent former Prime Minister to die. So now, with all that out of the way, it's time to answer the age-old question: where was every Australian Prime Minister born? Sir Edmund Barton. Sir Edmund Barton was the first Prime Minister of Australia from 1901 to 1903, holding office as the leader of the Protectionist Party. He resigned to become a founding member of the High Court of Australia, on which he served until his death. Barton was born on the 18th of January 1849 in Glebe, a suburb of Sydney, New South Wales. He was the 11th of 12 children born to Mary Louisa and William Barton. He had 7 sisters and 4 brothers, including the writer George Burnett Barton. 3 of his siblings died during his childhood, and Barton's parents were both born in London, England. Barton's birthplace makes him the first Prime Minister born in Australia, Sydney, and New South Wales. Alfred Deakin. Alfred Deakin was the second Prime Minister of Australia. He was leader of the Movement for Federation, which occurred in 1901, and during his 3 terms as Prime Minister over the subsequent decade, he played a key role in establishing national institutions. Deakin was born on the 3rd of August 1856 in his parents' cottage at 90 George Street, Fitzroy, Melbourne, Victoria. He was the younger of 2 children born to Sarah and William Deakin. Deakin's birthplace makes him the first Prime Minister born in Melbourne and Victoria. Johann Christian Tank, otherwise known as John Christian Watson or Chris Watson. Chris Watson was the 3rd Prime Minister of Australia, holding office from the 27th of April to the 18th of August 1904. He was the inaugural leader of the Australian Labor Party from 1901 to 1907 and was the first member of the party to serve as Prime Minister. Arguably holding the most interesting birth and birthplace of any Australian Prime Minister, Watson was born Johann Christian Tank on the 9th of April 1867 in Valparaiso, Chile. He was the only child of Martha and Johann Christian Tank Sr. His father was also born in Valparaiso, a German Chilean whose ancestors had immigrated from the Kingdom of Hanover. Johann Christian Tank Sr. was a commercial sailor who spent his life travelling the Pacific trade routes. He came to New Zealand on the La Joven Julia on December 24, 1865, and married Martha Minchin at Port Chalmers on January 19, 1866. Ireland's County Tipperary is the place of birth for Watson's mother, who wed Tank when she was just 16 years old. She accompanied him aboard the Julia, which later made its way back to Chile and anchored in Valparaiso a few days before Watson was born. Watson's mother relocated to New Zealand in 1868 so that she could rejoin her family on the South Island. As there exist no records of his father's passing, Johann Christian Tank Sr.'s whereabouts remain unknown. His mother, who listed herself as a widow, wed George Thomas Watson at the Waiporti Register Office on February 15, 1869. George Watson was a 30-year-old miner from Ballymoney, Ireland, who had spent some time working in Scotland before moving to New Zealand. Johann took on his stepfather's last name and was raised as George Watson's biological kid. It was also at this time that his given names were anglicised. While he was an adult, Watson provided false and inconsistent information regarding his birthplace and his parents' names. He would tell his second wife and daughter that he had been born to British parents in international seas outside Valparaiso. Alongside this, he also permitted certain biographers to represent him as having been born in New Zealand. Watson provided a false maiden name for his mother and named George Watson as his biological father on legal documents. Watson's biographers have speculated that he may have first disguised his past out of convenience, but had done so on purpose due to political considerations, including as uncertainty about his eligibility for parliamentary office and potential xenophobia. At the time, Watson would have been disqualified for election to the federal parliament under section 44 of the Constitution as an alien because of his abroad birth to a non-British father. Watson's birthplace makes him technically the first Prime Minister born outside of the United Kingdom, technically a New Zealander, technically born in Chile, and technically the first and only Prime Minister born outside the Anglosphere. Sir George Houston Reid, otherwise known as George Reid. George Reid was the fourth Prime Minister of Australia from 1904 to 1905, having previously been Premier of New South Wales from 1894 to 1899. He led the Free Trade Party from 1891 to 1908. Reid was born on the 25th of February 1845 in Johnston, Renfrewshire, Scotland. He was the fifth of 7 children born to Marion and John Reid. He had 4 older brothers and 2 younger sisters. Reid's birthplace makes him the first Prime Minister born in the British Isles in Scotland. Andrew Fisher. Andrew Fisher was the 5th Prime Minister of Australia, who served 3 terms as Prime Minister of Australia, from 1908 to 1909, from 1910 to 1913, and from 1914 to 1915. He was the leader of the Australian Labor Party from 1907 to 1915. Fisher was born on the 29th of August 1862 in Crosshouse, a mining village 3.2 kilometres west of Kilmarnock, Scotland. He was the second of 8 children born to Jane and Robert Fisher. He had 1 older brother, 4 younger brothers, and 2 younger sisters. Sir Joseph Cook. Sir Joseph Cook was the 6th Prime Minister of Australia, in office from 1913 to 1914. He was leader of the Liberal Party from 1913 to 1917, after earlier serving as the leader of the Anti-Socialist Party from 1908 to 1909. Cook was born on the 7th of December 1860 in a small cottage in Silverdale, Staffordshire, England. He was the second of 7 children born to Margaret and William Cook. His older sister Sarah died in 1865, but his 3 younger sisters and 2 younger brothers survived to adulthood. Cook's birthplace makes him the first Prime Minister born in England. William Morris Hughes, otherwise known as Billy Hughes. Billy Hughes was the 7th Prime Minister of Australia, in office from 1915 to 1923. Hughes was a member of Federal Parliament from Federation in 1901 until his death, the only person to have served for more than 50 years. A bit of a mad lad, he represented 6 political parties during his career, leading 5, outlasting 4, and being expelled from 3. Hughes was born the 25th of September 1862 at 7 Morton Place, Pimlico, London, the son of William and Jane Hughes. Both his parents were Welsh, and Hughes' birthplace makes him the first Prime Minister born in London. Stanley Melbourne Bruce, 1st Viscount Bruce of Melbourne, otherwise known as Stanley Bruce. Stanley Bruce was the 8th Prime Minister of Australia, serving from 1923 to 1929 as leader of the Nationalist Party. As his name suggests, Stanley Melbourne Bruce was born on the 15th of April 1883 in St Kilda, a suburb of Melbourne, Victoria, and was the youngest of 5 children. He disliked his given name and throughout his life preferred to be known as by initials SM, even among close friends. His wife simply called him S. James Henry Scullin, otherwise known as James Scullin. James Scullin was the 9th Prime Minister of Australia. Scullin led Labor to government at the 1929 Australia federal election and was Prime Minister from 1932 to 1935. Scullin was born in Trowalla, Victoria on the 18th of September 1876. His parents, John and Anne Scullin, were both Irish Catholics from County Londonderry. Joseph Aloysius Lyons, otherwise known as Joseph Lyons. Joseph Lyons was the 10th Prime Minister of Australia, in office from 1932 until his death in 1939. He began his career in the Australian Labor Party, but became the founding member of the United Australia Party after the Australian Labor Party split in 1931. Lyons was born in Stanley, Tasmania on the 15th of September 1879. He was the 5th of 8 children born to Ellen and Michael Henry Lyons, both of Irish descent. His mother was born in County Kildare and arrived in Australia in 1857, aged 11, while his father was born in Tasmania to immigrants from County Galway. Lyons was the first Prime Minister to have Australian-born parent, and his birthplace makes him the first and only Prime Minister born in Tasmania. Sir Earl Christmas Grafton Page, otherwise known as Earl Page. Earl Page was the 11th Prime Minister of Australia, holding office for just 19 days after the death of Joseph Lyons in 1939. He was leader of the Country Party from 1921 to 1939 and was the most influential figure in its early years. As his name suggests, Earl Christmas Grafton Page was born in Grafton, New South Wales on the 8th of August 1880. His first middle name, which he disliked, was given to him to carry on the surname of a childless relative, while his second name was in honour of his birthplace. Page was the fifth of 11 children born to Charles Page and Mary Johanna Haddon Cox. Sir Robert Gordon Menzies, otherwise known as Robert Menzies. Robert Menzies was the 12th and longest serving Prime Minister of Australia, holding office for over 18 years, from 1939 to 1941, and again from 1949 to 1966. Robert Menzies was born on the 20th of December 1894 at his parents' home in Jeparit, Victoria. He was the fourth of 5 children born to Kate and James Menzies. He had 2 older brothers, an elder sister, and a younger brother. Menzies was the first Australian Prime Minister to have 2 Australian-born parents. His father was born in Ballarat, Victoria, and his mother was born in Creswick, Victoria. Sir Arthur William Fadden, otherwise known as Arthur Fadden. Arthur Fadden was the 13th Prime Minister of Australia from the 29th of August to the 7th of October 1941. He was leader of the Country Party from 1940 to 1958, and was also Federal Treasurer for nearly 10 years, from 1940 to 1941 and from 1949 to 1958. Fadden was born in Ingham, Queensland on the 13th of April 1894. He was the eldest of 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters, born to Annan and Richard John Fadden. His parents were both born in Ireland, his mother in County Tyrone and his father in County Galway. Fadden's birthplace makes him the first Prime Minister born in Queensland. John Curtin. John Curtin was the 14th Prime Minister of Australia from 1941 until his death in 1945. Curtin was born in Creswick, Victoria on the 8th of January 1885. He was christened John Joseph Ambrose, although his middle names were not recorded on his birth certificate and he stopped using them in later life. Within his family, he was known as Jack. Curtin was the oldest of 4 children. His younger brother George was born in 1887, followed by his younger sisters Molly and Hannah in 1889 and 1891. His parents were both born in County Cork, Ireland. Francis Michael Ford, otherwise known as Frank Ford. Frank Ford was the 15th Prime Minister of Australia from the 6th to 13th of July 1945. He was Prime Minister in a caretaker capacity after the death of John Curtin, and is the shortest serving Prime Minister in Australia's history, serving for just 7 days. Ford was born in Mitchell, Queensland on the 18th of July 1890. He was the second of 6 children born to Ellen and John Ford. His parents were both Irish immigrants. His father was born in County Leitrim, while his mother was born in County Tipperary. Joseph Benedict Chifley, otherwise known as Ben Chifley. Ben Chifley was the 16th Prime Minister of Australia from 1945 to 1949. Chifley was born at 29 Havana Street, Bathurst, New South Wales on the 22nd of September 1885. He was the first of 3 sons born to Roman Catholic parents Mary Ann and Patrick Chifley II. His father was born in Bathurst to Irish immigrants from County Tipperary, while his mother was born in County Fermanagh in present-day Northern Ireland. Harold Edward Holt, otherwise known as Harold Holt. Harold Holt was the 17th Prime Minister of Australia from 1966 until his infamous presumed death in 1969. Holt was born on the 5th of August 1908 at his parents' home in Stanmore, a suburb of Sydney, New South Wales. He was the first of 2 sons born to Olive May and Thomas James Holt. Sir John McEwen. Sir John McEwen was the 18th Prime Minister of Australia, holding office from 1967 to 1968 in a caretaker capacity after the presumed disappearance of Harold Holt. McEwen was born on the 29th of March 1900 at his parents' home in Chiltern, Victoria. He was the son of Amy Ellen and David James McEwen. His mother was born in Victoria, and his father was of Ulster Scots origin, born in Mount Norris, County Armagh in present-day Northern Ireland. Sir John Grey Gorton, otherwise known as John Gorton. John Gorton was the 19th Prime Minister of Australia, serving from 1968 to 1971. John Grey Gorton was the second child of Alice and John Rose Gorton. His older sister Ruth was born in 1909. He had no birth certificate, but official forms recorded his date of birth as the 9th of September 1911 and his place of birth as Wellington, New Zealand. However, his birth was registered in the state of Victoria as occurring on the same date, but in the inner Melbourne suburb of Prahran. However, that document contained a number of inaccuracies. His name was given as John Alger Gordon, his parents were recorded as husband and wife, his father's name was incorrect, and his sister was recorded as having been deceased. At some point before 1932, Gorton's father told him that he'd actually been born in Wellington. While there are no records of his birth in New Zealand, it is known that his parents visited there frequently. John Gorton claimed to have been born in Wellington to a biographer in 1968, and listed the city as his place of birth on his RAF enlisting paperwork. He would be the only Australian Prime Minister born in New Zealand if this was the case, and the second to have been originally a New Zealander after Chris Watson. According to modifications to New Zealand's nationality rules, John Gorton would become a citizen on January 1st, 1949 if he was truly born there. In similar fashion to fellow New Zealander Chris Watson, according to Section 44 of the Australian Constitution, Gorton would have been permitted to serve in the Federal Parliament of Australia if he had dual citizenship, making it uncertain if Gorton was ever qualified to serve as a Member of Parliament during his career. Sir William McMahon. Sir William McMahon was the 20th Prime Minister of Australia, in office from 1971 to 1972 as leader of the Liberal Party. McMahon was born in Redfern, a suburb of Sydney, New South Wales, on the 23rd of February 1908. He was the third of 5 children born to solicitor William Daniel and Mary McMahon. Edward Gough Whitlam, otherwise known as Gough Whitlam. Gough Whitlam was the 21st Prime Minister of Australia, serving from 1972 to 1975. He was the longest serving federal leader of the Australian Labor Party, serving from 1967 to 1977. Whitlam was notable for being the leader of a reformist and socially progressive government that remarkably ended with his removal as Prime Minister after being ousted by Sir John Kerr, the Governor-General of Australia, at the height of the 1975 Australian constitutional crisis. Today, Whitlam remains the only ever Prime Minister of Australia to ever be dismissed from office. Edward Gough Whitlam was born on the 11th of July 1916 at his family home in Garda, at 46 Roland Street, Kew, a suburb of Melbourne, Victoria. He was the eldest of 2 children, alongside his sister Frida, who was born 4 years after him. He was born to Martha and Fred Whitlam. John Malcolm Fraser, otherwise known as Malcolm Fraser. Malcolm Fraser was the 22nd Prime Minister of Australia, serving from 1975 to 1983, holding office as the leader of the Liberal Party of Australia. John Malcolm Fraser was born in Toorak, Melbourne, Victoria on the 21st of May 1930. He was the second of 2 children born to Una Arnold and John Neville Fraser. His older sister Lorraine had been born in 1928. Robert James Lee Hawke, otherwise known as Bob Hawke. Bob Hawke was the 23rd Prime Minister of Australia, serving from 1983 to 1991, holding office as the leader of the Australian Labor Party. Bob Hawke was born on the 9th of December 1929 in Bordertown, South Australia, the second child of Arthur Hawke and his wife Edith Emily. His birthplace makes Bob Hawke the first and only Prime Minister born in South Australia. Paul John Keating, otherwise known as Paul Keating. Paul Keating was the 24th Prime Minister of Australia from 1991 to 1996, holding office as the leader of the Australian Labor Party. Keating was born at St Margaret's Hospital in Darlinghurst, Sydney on the 18th of January 1944. He was the first of 4 children born to Minnie and Matthew John Keating. John Winston Howard, otherwise known as John Howard. John Howard was the 25th Prime Minister of Australia from 1996 to 2007, holding office as leader of the Liberal Party. John Howard was born in Earlwood, a suburb of Sydney, New South Wales, on the 26th of July 1939. He was the 4th son of Mona and Lyle Howard. The site of his family home is now a KFC restaurant. Kevin Michael Rudd, otherwise known as Kevin Rudd. Kevin Rudd was the 26th Prime Minister of Australia from 2007 to 2010, and again from June 2013 to September of the same year, holding office as leader of the Australian Labor Party. Kevin Rudd was born in Nambour, Queensland on the 21st of September 1957 to Albert and Margaret Rudd. Julia Aline Gillard, otherwise known as Julia Gillard. Julia Gillard was the 27th Prime Minister of Australia from 2010 to 2013, holding office as leader of the Australian Labor Party. She is the first and only female Prime Minister in Australian history. Julia Gillard was born on the 29th of September 1961 in Barry, Vale of Glamorgan, Wales. She is the second of 2 daughters born to John Oliver Gillard and Moira Gillard. Her birthplace makes Julia Gillard the first and only Prime Minister born in Wales. Anthony John Abbott, otherwise known as Tony Abbott. Tony Abbott was the 28th Prime Minister of Australia from 2013 to 2015. Tony Abbott was born on the 4th of November 1957 at the General Lying-in Hospital in Lambeth, London, England. He is the oldest of 4 children born to Faye and Richard Henry Abbott. Malcolm Bligh Turnbull, otherwise known as Malcolm Turnbull. Malcolm Turnbull was the 29th Prime Minister of Australia from 2015 to 2018. Malcolm Turnbull was born in Sydney on the 24th of October 1954, the only child of Bruce Bligh Turnbull and Coral Magnolia Lansbury. Scott John Morrison, otherwise known as Scott Morrison. Scott Morrison was the 30th Prime Minister of Australia and leader of the Liberal Party of Australia from 2018 to 2022. Scott Morrison was born on the 13th of May 1968 in Waverley, a suburb of Sydney, New South Wales, the younger of two sons born to Marion and John Douglas Morrison. Anthony Norman Albanese, otherwise known as Anthony Albanese. Anthony Albanese is the 31st and current Prime Minister of Australia since 2022. Anthony Albanese was born on the 2nd of March 1963 at St Margaret's Hospital in Darlinghurst, a suburb of Sydney, New South Wales. He is the son of Carlo Albanese and Mary Ann Ellery. His mother was an Australian of Irish descent, while his Italian father was from Barletta in Apulia. The Italian surname Albanese is in reference to the Aberresh people, ethnic Albanians indigenous to the part of southern Italy where Albanese's father came from. And so there it is, after however long this video is after I make it, 31 people who have served as the 31 Prime Ministers of Australia. But of course, this is not the end of the video, because I have some stats. Of course, many of you probably find that boring, but I find it interesting, so fuck you. And so, here they are. In conclusion, out of the 31 Prime Ministers who have served Australia, a total of 23 were born within Australia, who represent 74.19% of all Prime Ministers. Within the 31, 10 were born in New South Wales. Within the 10, 8 from within the boundary of the city of Sydney. Interestingly enough, Paul Keating and Anthony Albanese were from Darlinghurst specifically. Alongside this, there were 2 from outer New South Wales, these being Earl Page and Ben Chifley. There were 8 Prime Ministers from Victoria, 4 from within the boundary of the city of Melbourne, and 4 from outer Victoria. 3 were from Queensland, and 1 was from both South Australia and Tasmania. Sadly, there is yet to be a Prime Minister born in either Western Australia or the Northern Territory. A total of 6 were from the United Kingdom, representing 19.55% of all Prime Ministers. 3 were from England, Billy Hughes and Tony Abbott from London specifically, 2 from Scotland and 1 from Wales. This ultimately leaves us with just 2 Prime Ministers being born outside of both the UK and Australia, representing 6.45% of all Australian Prime Ministers. John Gorton from New Zealand and Chris Watson technically being from Chile. And so there it is, a definite list of all our glorious 31 Prime Ministers who have served our likewise glorious nation of Australia. Yeah. Hopefully the video wasn't too long. Of course, won't know how long it is until I edit it, but hopefully not too long. But most of all, hope you learned something today. Maybe a Prime Minister was from your city, your town, even from your street. Of course, none were from my street, sadly, but it'd be pretty cool. Maybe if it's from your street, leave a comment down below. But anyways, yeah, hope you learned something today. I found out that we have a Prime Minister born in Chile, and it's technically illegal for him to have been Prime Minister, but you know, it's whatever. Water under the bridge. And yeah, this has been me, Jack, and if you're a current Prime Minister or former Prime Minister, please leave a comment down below.